What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we are going to be going over, ranking, and rating all of the Engineers Overclocks in DeepRockGalactic as of Season 5. Now I've been wanting to go through and tier list and make ratings for all the Overclock for a while now, but I figured instead of doing a big list of all of the Overclocks and having a video that is like an hour and a half long, I figured I might as well start off simply and do each of the classes individually, and then once I'm done with that I might put together a full-blown tier list of all of the Overclocks. But for today we're going to be talking about just the Engineers Overclocks and where they fit onto this particular tier list. So if you guys are ready, let's get into it. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so that way you never miss another upload if you want to see more tier lists in the future. All right, back to the video. So we're starting off with the primary weapon overclocks, and our first weapon is of course the Warthog Shotgun. And the first overclock we have is the lightweight magazines, which is a clean overclock that just gives you more maximum ammo and a quicker reload time. And this is actually pretty good for the Warthog. The Warthog likes both of these stats very well, and it is an overclock that actually can do a lot for you without sacrificing really anything. It's a clean overclock, so you don't lose anything for using this. And more ammo and a quicker reload time for the Warthog is always a good thing. It's never really a problem. So honestly, this is probably just going to go straight up into the A tier. It's a pretty good choice. Then next up for the Warthog, we have Stunner. Stunner makes it so that way you can stun the enemy if you hit them at any part of the body instead of just a weak point. And it also makes it so that way the weapon deals bonus damage to stunned enemies. This is also a really good option for the Warthog. And what I really like about this is that Stunner makes it so that way it just does more damage to just stunned enemies in general. It doesn't have to be just enemies that are stunned with the Warthog. So if you have an ally that's using a very heavy stun build, you can benefit from this pretty well. So honestly, this is probably another pretty good A tier because stunning is not only really good, but it helps to increase the Warthog damage output in a very good way. Then next up, we have a magnetic pellet alignment, which is the only balanced overclock for the Warthog, which is interesting, which gives you a much tighter spread and better weak point damage at the cost of less rate of fire. And this honestly isn't really that bad. The rate of fire decrease isn't too noticeable, and if you increase the rate of fire anyway, it's still not going to be too big of an issue. And this just makes the Warthog a little bit better at dealing with ranged enemies, dealing with more distant threats, things that you otherwise wouldn't really be able to hit. And if you are doing something where you're going up against something that has a very easy to hit weak spot, this can help you get significantly more damage output from it, which is just very good overall. So again, honestly, I'm probably going to put this in the A tier because it just really helps the Warthog a lot without really sacrificing too much. So Warthog has a lot of good overclocks, my goodness. Then we have Cycle Overload, which is probably one of the funnest of the overclocks for the Warthog, although it might not necessarily be the best of the best, but it is really, really good. This gives you more damage, a higher rate of fire, but it increases your reload time and also gives you a much wider spread. So basically, it's like the opposite of the magnetic pellet alignment, where you're basically just spraying and praying and just lighting up everything in the room. And overall, I would say, while not necessarily being my favorite, it is probably still an S tier in terms of what the Warthog can do, because it just allows you to get so much damage out and fling so many shells out. You will probably burn through ammo very quickly, which is probably the only real issue with this particular overclock. But even then, it's really not going to be too big of an issue. And if you just control your shots a little bit, it's not going to be that big of an issue. The extra damage and the extra rate of fire can just help you melt things very quickly, which is why it is probably one of the Warthog's best overclocks. Then we have mini shells. Mini shells is an overclock that I kind of wish was a little bit better personally. This gives you a ton of extra ammo, a much bigger magazine size, and takes away your recoil significantly, but it makes the Warthog significantly weaker than it already is by making it hit even less so, and it takes away your stun chance basically. So there's a couple of strategies that the mini shells can work really well in. If you're going for a very heavy turret whip setup and you just want to have as much ammo as you possibly can, the mini shells is all right. But for the most part, it really isn't an overclock that I tend to use a whole lot, because if I do want extra ammo and I want more shots, I'm probably just going to be using lightweight magazines, because I'm going to be able to get more ammo without having to sacrifice a lot more damage. So ultimately, I would say I'm probably going to put this one in the C tier just because it's all right. There are a couple of strategies that it can work in, but it really just doesn't have as much oomph as I would like as some of the other overclocks that we have. And then lastly, added with Season 5, we have the pump action, which is probably my personal favorite of the overclocks for the Warthog now. This gives you more damage, more pellets, and gives the weapon natural blow through, which means it can pierce through multiple enemies, as well as also making it so that way you actually pump the shotgun in between each shot. But the drawback is you have less ammo, you have less magazine size, and you have less rate of fire. Even with those particular drawbacks, I still would also probably put this in the S tier, Just even because of just sheer fun factor alone, this is probably one of the most effective overclocks for the Warthog. It makes the damage output significantly better without really sacrificing too much. The ammo hit and the magazine hit is not really that big of a deal if you can build up for it. And ultimately, this is probably the overclock that makes the Warthog hit as hard as it possibly can. So if you don't want to use it specifically just for turret whip shots, which is what most people use it for, you can actually use it for a very good weapon with this overclock. So next up, we have the Stubby SMG, which is the electro bullet hose. And the first overclock we have is super slim rounds for it, which just gives it a bigger magazine size and reduces the spread. Again, both of those are pretty good. They help the Stubby in a lot of ways. Those are two stats which the Stubby, of course, really likes to have. The extra magazine size isn't super duper noticeable, but it is very nice. And the extra spread is really good for giving it a little bit more range. It's not necessarily the most impactful overclock in the world, but it is really nice. So I'd probably put that at a solid B tier, I would say. It doesn't do a crazy amount for the weapon, but it is still pretty good. And then after that, we have well-oiled machine, which just gives you increased rate of fire and reduces your reload time. And this is a really good one for the Stubby. The Stubby's already a bullet hose, and this just kind of helps you lean into it a little bit more. It gives you significantly better damage output and also just allows you to just fling more shots into the enemies, which for the Stubby is really good. So I'd probably put this one into the A tier, like maybe low A tier, high B tier. It's kind of flip-flopping between those two a little bit, but overall this is a really good overclock. And then we have EM Refire Booster, which is similar to well-oiled machine in that it has to do with your rate of fire. This gives you a faster rate of fire, more electrical damage, but also gives you a wider spread as a drawback. Even with that, this overclock is still pretty useful, especially if you're building it out for a very heavy shock build. The spread can easily be compensated for, and the extra electrical damage is of course really nice. So I'd probably put this one in the B tier as well. It has some pretty good uses. It's not necessarily the most universally good one out of all of the Stubby's overclocks, but it is still pretty good. Then we have lightweight rounds, which basically just gives you a ton of extra ammo, but at the cost of damage and rate of fire. This one, I'm not super sure how I feel about it. I do like the fact that you have a lot of ammo with it, but the fact that you do have to sacrifice rate of fire and damage, which are two things that the Stubby really wants and two things that it really relies on. Its damage per shot is not super high to begin with, and the rate of fire is kind of one of the more valuable stats that the Stubby has. So I don't know if taking hits to them is necessarily worth the insane amount of ammo. You do get a lot with this, which I think really helps out a lot. I'd probably put this in maybe high C tier, and I'm not necessarily going to be putting these in any particular order in their tiers, but unless I specifically say otherwise. But yeah, lightweight rounds, it does a lot for you ammo-wise, but I don't know if I necessarily like the hit it takes to the other stats in comparison for it. And then we have the new overclock that was added with Season 5 with the Hyper Alloy Assembly. This basically makes it so that way you have a much tighter spread, much less horizontal recoil, but a little bit more vertical recoil, and way higher weak point damage at the cost of a smaller magazine. This is a bit of an awkward overclock to use because the recoil with it is still pretty difficult, especially the vertical recoil is really hard to control even if you're really good with a weapon. The weak point damage is really nice, but especially when you're fighting very mobile enemies with the increased recoil that this gives you, it can kind of be hard to hit those weak points unless they're really big on big targets like Praetorians and Oppressors. And the magazine hit kind of doesn't necessarily hurt the gun too much with it, but it still makes it feel like you have to reload a lot more. And ultimately, while this overclock wants you to be very precise with your shots, it also makes it kind of hard for you to be precise because it's a little bit more difficult to control. So I'm probably going to put this in a C tier as well, just because it's nice if you're able to control it, but it is very difficult to control. So that's what kind of makes it very difficult for players to pick up. Then next up, we have the Turret EM Discharge, which is one of the more powerful ones that the Stubby has. This basically is the one that gives you the ability to shoot your turret, to turn it into basically a plasma grenade. It bursts out and explodes and sends a big pulse of electric energy to all the nearby enemies. It does damage. It's really useful for crowd control, but it also makes it so that way the Stubby has less overall damage and less magazine size. Now, although it does reduce the damage of the Stubby, I still think this is probably one of the best overclocks that the Stubby has access to, because for crowd control and for taking out even bigger threats, this can be incredibly useful. The blast that this thing does is really good, and since it got buffed a while back, if I remember correctly, they made it so that way the explosion does not have damage fall off anymore, which means that even if an enemy just gets hit by the outer rim of the explosion, you're still getting the full damage off on the enemy, which is really good for something like this. The fact that you can spam it, it's really effective, and it's good for just clearing out massive groups of enemies as well as taking chunks out of bigger threats. And it doesn't really hurt the weapon too much. Yes, the magazine and damage hit is a little bit rough, but you can compensate for that a little bit. And ultimately, I just think that this is probably one of the Stubby's most effective overclocks. But then we have another contender for that, which is the newly reworked microconductor add-on for the Stubby. This used to be, if I recall correctly, called conductive bullets. If I'm not mistaken correctly, I might be a little bit wrong on that. But basically what this used to do was make it so that way you could fire at your sentry guns and basically make an electric fence between them to where if enemies cross through that electrical field, they would take damage and get slowed. And it now got updated to the point where now not only can it do that, but it can also electrify your platforms by making these fields of electric energy on your platforms that essentially function the same way as the electric fences that you can put up between your sentry guns. And you can have both of them up at the same time. And you can have basically as many electrical traps on your platforms as you want. In fact, I put together a build with this not too long ago that was really, really effective at crowd control. So if you want to see it in action, check that out. Now, the drawback to it is it does take away a lot of your maximum ammo and does lower your rate of fire significantly. But with this particular overclock, you're not necessarily building it out for dealing damage with the weapon itself. You're dealing with making a impassable terrain for the enemies to get through, which are incredibly effective at slowing the enemy down. If you lace up your platforms, which keep in mind when you use this particular overclock, you do not want to have repellent additive on your platform because you want the bugs to actually be standing on them so they can get hit. But so long as you remember to use that, this is really, really, really good at stopping big swarms of enemies from getting close to you. Sabotage missions, any sort of holdout is really, really good. And ultimately, I would probably put this even higher than Turret EM Discharge. Turret EM Discharge is still really, really good, but this I think just has way more applications that it can be very useful in. Moving on to the Lock 1 Smart Rifle, or the Loki Rifle as I like to call it, and our first overclock is Eraser. This basically just gives you more magazines and more locked targets. This is pretty good. One of the biggest issues with the Loki Rifle is it runs out of ammo very fast, and that's kind of the biggest thing that a lot of people have trouble with. So giving him more ammo is really good, but also at the same time giving him more locked targets kind of already makes that ammo be used a lot more. But still, this is just a general good increase in damage and performance for the Loki Rifle that doesn't take away a whole lot, so I'll put it in the solid B tier. It's not great, it's not phenomenal, but it is a damage increase nonetheless. And then next up, we have the Armor Break module, which makes it so that way when all of your locks are on target, you have significantly increased armor break power, which is pretty useful if you're able to get it off. And if you're fighting a single target, this can be really, really good at shredding armor. The only problem is that if you are trying to break enemy armor, chances are the engineer has some much better alternatives for that, especially with his secondary weapons. So this one, I don't really see myself using a whole lot, especially since you do have to commit an entire lock's worth of shots in order to even just get the armor break potential. So if you don't, you're not even going to get this. So I probably put this in C tier. It's all right if you're able to get it off, but for me personally, I just don't ever see myself using this a whole lot. Then we have the Neuro Lasso, which this used to be an unstable overclock, if I remember correctly, and they downgraded it to a balanced for, I guess, understandable reasons. Basically, this slows down targets that you have locked, and it also limits the duration of the lock-ons to 8 seconds. So basically, if you are locked on, but you haven't fired at the target yet, they are slowed down, but you can only remain locked onto a target for 8 seconds, so you can't just keep this up as a constant slowdown. I never really found a use for this particular overclock personally. I just feel like this one gets overshadowed by the other two balanced overclocks for the Loki Rifle in an insane way because they are really good, which we'll talk about a little later. So I'm probably going to put this in D tier. I just never really got around to using this one. I never really found a way to use it because you have to keep locked on to the target but not use your shots. So it's just a very awkward feeling to use with this. If they changed it up a little bit, it might be a little bit better, but for right now, I just hardly ever use it. Then next up, we have probably the Loki's, or one of the Loki's best overclocks with the explosive chemical rounds. This is a really good damage increasing overclock. This basically makes it so that way, if you have at least 3 locks onto a target, when you release it, it will cause them to explode. It causes a big burst of damage to the enemy at the cost of less direct damage with the weapon and less ammo. This is still probably one of, if not the Loki Rifle's best overclocks. There's some other ones out there that are pretty good and can do a lot. This one, however, is just insanely good because the consistent damage output you have with it is really good, and it also kind of solves the issue that the Loki has with its ammo problems. Even though this takes away ammo, the fact that you have to be careful with your shots because you don't necessarily want more than 3 locks onto a particular target kind of forces you to play a little bit more conservatively with your ammo, which gets around the issue that a lot of people are having with it. And the damage output you can get with this thing is really good. It essentially turns the weapon into a burst rifle, which is really good and obviously helps you control your ammo a lot more. And the damage output is just really good. Then next up, we have Seeker rounds, which is basically an overclock that gives you aimbot and wall hacks. Basically, once you're locked onto the target, your shots will always hit them no matter what, even if you're through a wall or around a corner, which is really useful. It also makes it so that way you have a much bigger lock threshold, so you don't lose them nearly as much. And it makes it so that way your shots will always hit, even if it's through enemy armor. Now, this does also make it so that way your burst fire rate or your rate of fire is a lot slower, and your reload time is a lot longer. So this one is a pretty consistent option that if you're somebody who is having a hard time hitting enemies with problematic armor pieces, this could be really good. It can also help you play very safe because you can come out from around a corner, lock onto the enemy, and then go back around the corner and you'll be safe and you'll be able to hit them. So in that sense, it's actually pretty good. It's just not really that good for very big burst damage. It's good for more sustained fire on things that you have a hard time hitting. It also makes it that way you don't have to worry about getting good angles. So I'd probably put this one in B tier. Not great, not phenomenal, but also pretty good and is relatively easy to use. Then we have Executioner. Executioner makes it so that way if you have full locks on target, you have significantly increased weak point damage, and your lock on time in general is a lot quicker. Now, this also makes it that way you have less ammo, less magazine size, and less overall max lock targets. So basically, this is telling you you have far fewer locks to work with and you want to focus on one enemy. But if you do put all your locks on one enemy, they're going to take a lot of damage. This is a pretty good one for a lot of different mission types, elimination, or just pretty much any problematic threat you have. And it can do a lot of things, even if you are just going up against smaller threats as well. The ammo hit is not nearly as bad as on some of the other overclocks. So I'd probably put this one, honestly, solid A tier. I don't think it's the best that the Loki has access to, but it is definitely really good in terms of taking out those bigger threats, which the engineer does have a lot of tools that he can work with. And this is just one of them. So then we have the recently added Smart Trigger OS. This is a bit of a complicated overclock. This basically makes it so that way your lock-on time is significantly faster, but you have pretty much almost no lock targets. You have, I think, like at a max of 3 if you have all of the upgrades for it. And it also makes it so that way when you hit max lock-on, you immediately fire and hit at everything that you have locked onto. So basically, it turns the gun into less of a smart rifle and more of just a burst fire rifle is kind of the best way to describe it. And it makes it so that way it's a little bit more user-friendly, at least in my opinion, because you don't have to worry too much about holding the locks on. And it also makes the gameplay loop a little bit more enjoyable because it's not like you have to hold on and then wait for your locks to fan out and then let go and then do it again and again. It's a little bit quicker, like boom, boom. That being said, though, it's not necessarily the most effective of the Loki's overclocks, but I do think it does have some places. So I'll probably put this one in the B tier. It's good. I wouldn't say it's the best, but it is definitely usable in a lot of ways. So moving on to the secondary weapons, and we have the grenade launcher, and the first one we have access to is Clean Sweep. Clean Sweep is pretty straightforward. It just gives you more of an effect radius and more area damage. Grenade Launcher likes both of those things a lot, and it's pretty useful to have this. There's no drawback to it whatsoever. It just gives you a little bit more damage output. There are some slightly better options down the line, but overall, I'm just going to probably put this in B tier. Nothing wrong with it. It's just a steady damage increase. And then we have Pack Rat, which probably is one of the simplest overclocks in the entire game because it just gives you 2 extra rounds for the grenade launcher. Woo. It's not that it's bad. I'm probably going to put this one in D tier, not because necessarily it's bad, but because, as we'll soon see in a moment, the grenade launcher has other ammo increasing overclocks, which just overall give you a little bit more bang for your buck in most cases. The 2 rounds is not bad, but you're going to burn through those rounds so quickly that it's going to feel like they're not even really there. And I feel as though if this gave you, even if it just gave you 1 extra round or something else along those lines, maybe a quicker reload speed or something, then it might be a little bit more worth it, but it's just a little bit too plain when compared to anything else that the grenade launcher has. Which, speaking of which, our next option is compact rounds, which gives you even more ammo than Pack Rat, but also reduces your area damage and your effect radius. This isn't too big of an issue because already the area damage and radius of the grenade launcher is pretty good, and you can compensate for this a little bit to basically just have a even better version of Pack Rat. That being said, I don't really see myself using this one a whole lot, and I don't really see a whole lot of people using this one a whole lot, so I am probably going to put this one in maybe C tier. It's just, it's good, but it's a little bit better than the Pack Rat, obviously, but it still just doesn't have quite as much as you would want to see out of something like increasing ammo for the grenade launcher. But then next up, we have the RJ250 compound, which is arguably one of the funnest overclocks in the entire game. This gives you even more ammo than Pack Rat, and it significantly nerfs the amount of damage that you can do with it, but it gives you the ability to basically grenade jump straight out of TF2, basically. This is a phenomenal overclock for a lot of different reasons. Yes, the hit to your area damage is a bit rough, but if you build it out properly, you can still get good use out of this thing in terms of damage. You can still use it to clear fodder enemies very easily. And the amount of mobility this thing can get you, especially for someone like the engineer who really lacks mobility in quick moments when he needs it, this is a great overclock. It gives you a lot of ammo. While you might not necessarily be hitting things quite as hard, if you build it out a certain way, you can still be doing some good damage or maybe some more indirect damage. And just the fact that you have an insane amount of mobility with this gives you so much potential for some fun plays. And that's why it's just such a fun overclock. Then next up, we have Fat Boy. Fat Boy is basically one that makes your grenade launcher into a mini nuke launcher. You have a ridiculously wide area of effect and a much bigger area damage, but you have practically no ammo and no velocity with this thing whatsoever. You are going to burn through rounds with this very fast, even if you build for solely ammo. This is kind of a difficult one to say because some people have mixed opinions about this particular one, but I just think this is great. Do I think it's S tier? I wouldn't necessarily call it S tier. I'd probably put it in the A tier just because it's insanely fun to use. And the area of effect that this thing controls is very good. The only real thing is, again, it has practically no ammo, so you're going to be able to fire like 3 or 4 shots of this thing before you run out. And with that, it's not really going to be nearly as effective as you might want it to be, but it is still a lot of fun. It is still really good for clearing out big groups of enemies. Then next up, we have Hyper Propellant. Hyper Propellant basically turns the grenade launcher into a railgun, at least in my personal opinion. It gives you significantly increased direct hit damage. The velocity is insane to where you're basically firing in a straight line, but you have practically no radius whatsoever. You have hardly any ammo, and it basically converts some of the damage into a different damage type, which is a little bit more technical than that. But basically, it goes from big grenade to very precise projectile that deals an insane amount of impact damage. So this is for when you want to hit one thing really hard. So Fat Boy is you want to clear the entire room. Hyper Propellant is you want to kill one thing very effectively. And this, in my personal opinion, is probably one of the grenade launcher's best overclocks. It is really effective, really good. It does a lot for single targets, which the engineer kind of with most of his kit already has area damage pretty well controlled, including other options for the grenade launcher itself. So the fact that we have something that can give the grenade launcher more single target damage, I think is something that is very welcome and something that is incredibly useful on many different circumstances. So now we're moving on to the Breach Cutter, and the Breach Cutter is already a really good secondary, so its overclocks just kind of help improve it a little bit. First up, we have lightweight cases. Lightweight cases literally just gives you more ammo and more reload speed. This is insanely good for the Breach Cutter, even though it's only a clean overclock. The Breach Cutter is already one of the best secondaries in the entire game, and just giving him more shots and making it easier for you to shoot it. Honestly, even though this is a clean overclock, it is an S tier overclock because this is probably one of the best things that you could use for the Breach Cutter, despite how simple it is. It just overall increases its effectiveness when you don't even necessarily have to. And more shots and a quicker reload speed for the Breach Cutter is phenomenal. Then we have Roll Control, which is a overclock that was changed a lot in its most recent iteration. Basically, what this does is it makes the projectile last a lot longer, so you will just be out damaging things for longer. And what happens now is that the projectile will constantly be spinning and you have the ability to steer the projectile as it's moving. So you can use it as basically kind of like a meat grinder, and it'll just be spinning around like a top, and you can aim it towards big groups of enemies or singular threats that you want to take, although this is really, really good for clearing out massive groups of enemies. This is a very, very fun overclock. It's not necessarily the most practical thing in the world in some circumstances. It definitely has its uses, but it's definitely more of a fun overclock than a super duper efficient overclock. So I'll probably put it in the B tier. It's a lot of fun. It's really useful in certain circumstances. It's not necessarily the most universal thing that the breach cutter can use, but it is definitely a lot of fun and can be useful in the right circumstances. Then next up, we have a stronger plasma current, which just gives the beam a little bit more damage and a little bit longer lifetime. Again, this is really, really good on the breach cutter. The breach cutter already does a lot of damage. So the fact that you're just going to be buffing it a little bit straight up just with no drawbacks is already really good. This is honestly up there with lightweight cases to where it is really, really good. I'm going to put it in A tier because especially with the breach cutter, simple is sometimes better than the more complex because the breach cutter is already really, really good to the point where you don't really need to change too many things about it. So if you're just giving it a straight upgrade to things, that in most cases is what you're going to need for it. Then we have Return to Sender. This is the one that allows you to basically fire out the beam and then you can hit it again to bring it back to you. So you can hit things essentially twice with one shot, giving you the potential for double damage, but not necessarily the case depending on how it works. This is a interesting overclock, but one that I've never really been able to use a whole lot. Also, this reduces your max ammo, so you're not going to be able to fire nearly as much. I guess the mindset is that because you're going to be able to use beam essentially twice, they don't want to give you as much ammo with it, which I guess makes sense, but it also just makes it that way it's a little bit harder to use because in the heat of many different encounters, you're not necessarily going to be paying so much attention to where your beam actually is. And the lack of ammo just means you're not going to be able to shoot nearly as much. So I'm probably going to put this one in the C tier. It's not my favorite thing to use in the world. It's fun, it's interesting, but it's not necessarily super duper effective unless you're in very specific circumstances. But again, you can use this and it can work out pretty well. Then next up, we have High Voltage Crossover. This is the one that makes it so that way your beam can actually electrify enemies. It can apply shock damage to them, but it also reduces your magazine size. This one is okay. It's all right in a couple of niche circumstances or if you're really trying to build for an elemental effect. But outside of that, it's not really super duper useful. The breach cutter has a lot of ways that it can handle crowds very well already, so you don't necessarily need to be spreading electricity that much. And if you really want to, you could be using things like the Stubby, which just do this way better. So this is probably gonna be another C tier. It's not bad, but it's not great. Then next up, we have Inferno. Inferno makes it so that way the beam can light things on fire, which can be pretty useful, with the drawback being the beam does significantly less damage and it also has significantly less armor breaking. Even with that, this is still a really, really good overclock just because fire is such a useful element in the game. A lot of things are weak to fire. The bots can be killed instantly with fire. Fire is just such a good effect in the game that even the significant reduced damage and armor breaking, I still think this is probably an A tier just because the amount of extra damage you can put on this thing with the extra fire damage can be really, really good. And so many people can benefit off of this. If you have enemies that are benefiting off of your elemental effect, this can be really, really good. And just overall spreading that kind of damage over time is never a bad thing. Even with the significant hit to your damage, this is still really, really good. And then lastly, for the breach cutter, we have Spinning Death. Spinning Death makes it so that way when you fire out the projectile, it immediately starts spinning like a Beyblade. And it also lasts for a lot longer and has a much wider width. But the overall beam damage is lower and the max ammo is lower and the magazine is lower. So all those things sound like pretty big drawbacks, and those drawbacks might take some people out of it. But the Spinning Death can actually be very useful, especially on the higher hazard levels, because you can't be hit by the beam. It obviously has friendly fire, but you yourself cannot be hit by the beam. So if you're on the higher hazard levels, you can basically create a safe zone around you by just shooting it out and spinning. That way, the enemies basically can't get to you for at least a couple of seconds, which can be pretty useful. Outside of that, it can be a little bit difficult for some people to use. Just the way that it functions very differently than the breach cutter normally. And also, you kind of need to be in the right circumstance for this to work properly. Otherwise, you're just going to be in a really weird spot. You have to get really close to enemies in order for you to apply this directly. So I'm probably going to put this, I'll probably put this in the high B tier, really close to A tier. It's really good, but the fact that the weapon functions very differently on a base level practically when you use this is probably the biggest reason why people have a hard time using it. And the fact that it can only be useful when you're really up close with the enemy can kind of make it a little bit hard to use. Then finally, we have the Shard Diffractor. the laser beam of death. And the first overclock we have is its only clean overclock, which is efficiency tweaks. This just gives you more ammo capacity and more charge capacity. For the shard diffractor, this is really good. There's not really a whole lot of downside to this. This just gives you more battery and more charge, which the shard diffractor really likes. There's not really that big of a drawback. It doesn't really give you a whole lot more damage output. It just gives you a little bit more sustainability. So we'll probably put this in the B tier. Good, it's fine. It helps out the shard diffractor in a lot of ways, but it's not too crazy. Then we have the Voltaic Impact Reactor. The Voltaic Impact Reactor basically makes it so that way the shard diffractor becomes the flamethrower. When you hit the ground, you will basically be turning the ground into hot magma, which functions similarly to the driller's sticky fuel on its flamethrower, and it basically makes it so that way it creates a tough terrain that the enemy has to get through, with the drawback being less area damage and less charge capacity. This one is really good, especially for making tough spots that the enemy has to get through. It makes it so that way even if you do miss with the shard diffractor, you're still going to be profiting off of enemy damage because you're going to be able to make a difficult hazard that they have to get through. And while the less area radius and charge capacity can be a bit of a issue to get through, you can still build out this to where that's not really going to be that much of an issue. And the extra heat damage, again, like I said, can be very useful. So this is probably going to be another A tier. This is really good, especially for just crowd control and slowing down enemies as they try to get close to you. Then next up, we have Automated Beam Controller. This is a rough one. This is a really rough overclock. This basically gives you a ton of ammo and a faster rate of fire of sorts and a slower recharge time, but your charge capacity is a lot lower. And when you fire out the weapon, it fires continuously until it is drained. Now you can pickaxe cancel to stop it, but that's going to take a big chunk of your remaining battery out. So basically, if you're going to use this thing, you have to use it entirely on one enemy. This can be really difficult to use in a lot of ways, especially if you've never used the shard diffractor and this may be one of your first overclocks. It can be really rough to use, especially since every time you use it, you basically have to use the entire magazine. So if you are in a position where you don't necessarily want to do that, this is going to be really rough because you essentially have to be very careful about how you use the shard diffractor. So honestly, I'm probably going to put this one also in the D tier just because the fact that you're not in control of it and the fact that the weapon kind of just does its own thing, regardless of whether or not you're fighting one enemy or a bunch, means you have to be very mindful about when you want to use it. And you have to think about whether or not it's worth just to dump the entire battery into a couple of enemies. Because if you mess up, then you are just going to be losing a lot of ammo and no one likes that. Then lastly, we have Feedback Loop. This one is pretty good. It makes it so that way you have less overall battery capacity, but the beam itself gets bigger and stronger the longer you keep it onto one particular target. This can be really good for single target threats as well as also for clearing out mass groups of enemies, because just so long as you just keep the beam going and keep hitting enemies, you will get a bigger and more stronger beam. The less total capacity is not really that big of a deal because you can build off of this effectively. So I would probably put this one, high B tier. It's not the most amazing thing that the shard diffractor has access to, but it is pretty consistently good and allows you to get a much higher damage output if you're really good at keeping the beam on target. So then next up, we have the Overdrive Booster. The Overdrive Booster is an unstable overclock that is actually just a clean overclock in disguise. Basically what this does is it gives you the ability to, while you are firing the shard diffractor, to overcharge it and basically make the beam significantly stronger and do a lot more damage, but you cannot move while shooting it and you have to fire it until it is completely empty, similar to the automated beam controller, except for you're actually in complete control of when you activate it or not. Now, the thing about this particular overclock is if you don't activate the overcharge mechanic, the shard diffractor functions exactly the way that it normally does if it doesn't have any overclocks at all, which is why I would call this a clean overclock in disguise, because you're not actually losing anything because the negative effects that come with this particular overclock are solely tied to the ability, which if you don't use it, you don't get it. That being said, the Overdrive Booster is insane and very effective for the shard diffractor, as it gives you the ability to just literally melt things into dust. Anything that you point this at while the overdrive is active is just going to take an insane amount of damage in a very short period of time. And again, you can pickaxe cancel it, which will, like the automated beam controller, make you lose a lot of the ammo. But the fact that you have complete control of when you use this gives it a lot more flexibility and control. And again, the fact that you don't suffer any of the negative drawbacks unless you are using the overdrive makes it significantly better, which is why I would definitely say this is probably the best overclock that the shard diffractor has access to. But not too far off of it is the Plascrete Catalyst. The Plascrete Catalyst is the one that makes it so that way basically you can fire the beam at your platforms and blow them up and basically turn them into landmines. Now, the drawbacks are less total capacity and a longer recharge time, which can be a little bit annoying, but isn't necessarily that bad. And also, when you do trigger the explosion on the Plascrete Catalyst, it does basically stop the beam and you have to stop for a couple of seconds. That way you can't chain it together. But even with that, this is still a pretty good overclock. It is a little bit specific in the way that you have to use it because you have to use 2 of your pieces of equipment to actually get the damage output off. And you do have to sacrifice your platforms, which in some cases can be very valuable. So I would probably put this one in the high B tier, close to A tier, because it is very effective when you do get it off. And it is really good at clearing out massive groups of enemies, but the fact that you do need to use your platforms with it and it can be a little bit tricky to use at first. It's not super useful on every single engineer build, but it can be useful in a lot of them. And there we have the engineer overclocks tier listed as of season 5. I'm not super surprised or upset with really any of these particular placements. I feel like some of them I could have shifted around a little bit, but for the most part, I'm pretty happy with where everything is. And I hope you guys enjoyed this as well. I've been wanting to do something like this for a little while, and I hope I didn't make too many people upset. Keep in mind that your list will probably look very different than mine, and that is completely okay. Everybody likes to have different things in this game, and some people might think Neuro Lasso or Lightweight Rounds or Hyperalloy Assembly are fantastic, and that's totally fine if you do. This is just how I play, this is just how I feel, and these are the way that I see these overclocks being. And if you guys do disagree or differ on some of these placements, let me know down in the comments because I love to hear what you guys have to say. But just remember that the real S tier overclocks that are out there are whichever one you have the most fun playing with and whichever one you like the most. And in any event, I hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. If you did, please be sure to let me know by hitting that like and subscribe button and consider becoming a member today as it really helps me out a lot. Rock and Stone Miners, I will see you in the next video.